Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all here. This is another of our 3Rs webinars hosted by the Johns Hopkins Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing. My name is Kat Herman. I am the director of the Beyond Classical Refinement program at CAAT, and I'm very happy to see you all here. It's a special day. It's the World Day for Animals and Laboratories. And it's a day where we want to think about them, about the suffering they endure, if it's justified to use animals in science. This is something we will obviously talk about today. What we can do to overcome certain hurdles we face when we want to engage in animal-free methods as early career scientists, especially, but obviously all the scientists are addressed here. And I'm very excited to have Love Hansell with us today. He's a political scientist and a PhD researcher at Radboud University in the Netherlands. And his work explores the systemic hurdles blocking the transition to animal-free science. And I'm also happy to announce that currently he's a guest researcher with CAAT. So he's actually a colleague of mine, which is very exciting. We already have some good projects in mind, I think. And so today he will talk to us about, okay, we know that the gold standard, unfortunately, is still animal use in many laboratories around the world. And he's going to address those hurdles. And it's going to be very exciting. Love, I hand it over to you. Thanks for being here today and giving this presentation.
Good evening, good morning, good day, everybody. It's truly an honor to be here. Thank you all for tuning in. As Catherine mentioned, I'm a political scientist with a background in public administration and comparative politics, and I'm part of the SAFE Consortium, a transdisciplinary international consortium, which is tasked with accelerating the transition to animal-free innovation, particularly in safety assessment. So that's what my PhD is currently on. This is the kind of background I'm coming from. And my background is in political science, but lately I've been looking a lot more into science and technology studies, sociology of science, and transformative governance as kind of theoretical lenses to look at this transition and to look at the role of animal testing more broadly. So my talk today is mainly going to be a theoretical perspective. As you can see from what I've been mentioning, I haven't worked in the lab. I'm not a hard scientist or natural scientist, but I hope this could be a kind of theoretical perspective, and then hopefully with the panel discussion we have afterwards to have a more praxis-oriented, really practical example and experiences from this, and hopefully we can have a nice discussion then. I'd like to just start by saying that I think a transition to animal-free is absolutely needed. So in the topic I'm looking at in safety assessment, but also more broadly, I see this as quite a necessity. It's both an ethical imperative, but also in terms of we care about human health or environmental health, or even the health of animals. It's an absolute imperative that we do this. So I won't dwell on this point. I don't want to have this as a point of argument. I'm saying this in the beginning to say that this is how I want to start the discussion. And I've structured the presentation to be exploring other aspects of this, and particularly the kind of social and institutional barriers to the use of transitioning away from animal testing. So with that, I've kind of structured my talk in 4 different points. So the first thing I want to talk about is the science, politics, and power. And kind of take-home message that I'm putting up here straight from the beginning is that I want to argue that science is political, and that anthropocentrism is crucial for the kind of quote-unquote modern world we live in. And I'm kind of inspired by this quote, to see what is in front of one's nose, one needs a constant struggle. So what I'm trying to explore here is to really look at the ways that social science can help us see the ways in which anthropocentrism is really woven into our social and political daily lives, and to really have that as a background before we look at the more bit more tangible ways that we can see barriers to the transition to animal-free innovation. The second part will be looking at animal science and us. I want to try and explore, see how we're really in this together, whether we are non-human animals and humans, and to really encourage us, even after today, to see the ties between the two, and not to encourage these divisions and siloing that we usually see, and which keep us from really seeing how we're really in this together. And the third is to look at the barriers to transitioning. So as we see here, we have the Great Barrier Reef. So we're going to also be exploring barriers, but particularly the kind of social and feedback loops which slow the transition to animal-free innovation. And lastly, to look at the opportunities to transitioning, which would be, take-home message is to find others who are doing this and to really jump on board when it comes to the change that is coming, because it's already here as well. And also like to say, I think this is in general, a very complex issue. It's taken me a lot of time to kind of wrap my head around, but I've tried to distill the barriers and gear this towards really looking at the part of the theme today, which is early career researchers. So this is a really slanted part of my discussion to really go in that direction. Excuse me. So to our first part, science, politics, and power. And with that, I thought we would just start with a bang. This is the Castle Bravo atomic experiment, nuclear testing that's been done in the 50s in Bikini Atoll in the Pacific. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think it lays the ground a bit for some of the discussion that I want to explore in this section, which is that science and politics are really tied together. I'm inspired by this quote by Sheila Yasunov, a researcher in science and technology studies who looks at the role of experts in regulatory systems. And what I'm really getting from this quote is to say that we can't really divorce away science from politics, and that there's a kind of duty of care and a responsibility on us to, as researchers, and this includes social scientists as well, to really think about our role in all this. So I think ethics is a really crucial part of how we should conduct ourselves in these spaces. So this explosion that you're seeing right here affected this man and the crew of this fishing boat. His name was Oshi Matashishi. Apologies for the mispronunciation, I'm sure that I'm doing. But he was irradiated along with the other 22 people that was on part of his boat. And some of them died of acute radiation poisoning of all different levels of exposure. But this story became a cause célèbre in Japan, which also inspired the beginning of the first Godzilla movie. So with this, I'm also trying to sow the seed of saying that science and power and also has deep reverberations in our world, even all the way to the general publics. And we're going to be revisiting the general publics later as well. Talking about science and politics and power, I think it would be remiss if I didn't mention this person. Her name is Henrietta Lacks. She was an African-American woman from Virginia in the US, and she checked in here in Baltimore at Johns Hopkins University in February 1951, and where she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and she died 8 months later. But the cells that were taken from her biopsy were taken and distributed and reproduced without her or her family's consent. After that, the HeLa cells that were named after her, became the first standard cell line, and they've since become very useful and famous in the biomedical field, and have been the basis of many, many countless innovations and insights and research in public health and biomedical research in general. Incidentally, her cells were actually taken to space before Yuri Gagarin or before the dog Laika. So again, we're seeing another tie-in with that between space and technology and politics and power are all really deeply interrelated. But indeed, we can see this in many different aspects. So in this sense, I think it's important to see that science and politics and economics are all interrelated. We don't have the growth of nation states or capitalism without this cooperation of these three, whether it be in animal agriculture, as we see here, or For example, the use of animals in war. This is a monument or picture in commemoration of the 8 million horses and mules who died in World War One. Or even this is the prototype missile that was supposed to be guided by a pigeon. This was truly considered for a while. Or even the use of animal testing, which is the topic of today. We're talking about millions of individuals which are being used and are deeply interrelated into these systems of power. So our first take-home message here is that science, politics, and economics are all interrelated, whether it be in animal agriculture, biotech industry, or the space and arms industry. And anthropocentrism is foundational to the system. It has deep colonial and racist scientific legacy, which we don't have time to go into today. And really, I just want to stress this, that science is non-neutral. It is political, and if only because it's part of a political project. In this sense, I really see life, whether it be humans or non-human animals or nature, as kind of unwilling participants in this. To end with this quote. So to be sure, scientists claim to speak for nature, whereas democratic governments speak on behalf of public wants, needs, interests, and visions of the good. Yet, since both forms of representation are implicated in the exercise of power, scientists, political rulers, and ordinary people all have an interest in the legitimacy of both. Also in the practices by which scientists and politicians gain and exercise authority. And again, this is this idea of practices or the behavior or the conditioned behavior we have of scientists and politicians is really where I'm looking a lot during my research, and I think it's also relevant to our discussion today. We're going to be going into more detail of this later. So into our next section, animal science and us. So I think it's a really useful lens to see non-human animals, particularly in the space of animal testing, as biotechnology, because that's really, I think, one of the most useful ways to think of how they are treated in this system. And of course, we can't divorce this away from anthropocentrism, right? So non-human animals don't have political rights in the system that I'm trying to describe here, which is, of course, a global system from the global north, and really based on anthropocentrism in general. The anthropocentrism makes them more invisible and objectified, which enables them to be commodified and treated as biotechnology. So as mentioned, this is a system which is stemming from the global north and reinforces power relations over non-humans and even humans as well. But again, that's another aspect we don't have time to go into today. So I'm highlighting this as the kind of water we're swimming in. So it's reinforced to the cultural and political and social legal systems that we navigate every day. We don't maybe not necessarily think of all the time. But that's also why I think it's just as important to really highlight them and make this invisible aspect visible. So one lens that we can try and explore this connection between animal testing and us, and there are many ways we can do, but as I said, I'm really trying to cherry pick some of the more salient ones or ones that can be a bit thought-provoking. One could be the idea of enhancement. So in non-human animal research, it's standard in biomedical research to do genetic manipulation. So here we have one example of a human growth hormone gene used in a mouse to make to change it and make it bigger. But we're also seeing this now implemented in humans as well, whether it be in warfare and health or in spaceflight. Again, the themes that we explored earlier, power and politics and technology, are all interrelated here. So I'm highlighting this just to see how we can see how we are linked to animals, particularly non-human animals used in animal testing. And I think they at least deserve to have this perception put onto it and to really see how we are linked in this enterprise. Another is we can look at just the humans who are involved in animal testing. So we can see them as this through an occupational safety and health view or workers' rights. There are some studies which have indicated that people who are involved in these animal testings for a long time suffer from allergies or have physical ailments from it, including also mental health associated with it, or even be socially ostracized from being involved in this kind of work. So it's also an aspect that we should think about. But of course, another big one, and this is what I focus a lot for my own work in my own research, is the safety assessment aspect. So animal testing is really everywhere in our daily lives, whether we're talking about in our food through the use of pesticides, you need to do animal testing to do this, or in the pharmaceuticals we use or the cosmetics we use. In this sense, animal testing is really intimate and closely related with our daily lives. In this sense, it also becomes a public health issue. So, as I mentioned at the top, I don't consider the current system to be a sustainable one. We need to transition to a safety assessment system which is not based on animals and not based on animal testing. I believe it's keeping us more unsafe. It's hindering us from developing better drugs and pharmaceuticals, and it's hindering us from really getting an accurate understanding of our exposure to a lot of different chemicals, for example, in our environment. So it's both moral necessity and a human health and public health issue. So to round this section off, the takeaway message we can have is that what happens to them is also what's happening to us too. Our fates are linked. What happens to non-human animals, especially in the animal testing things, is tells a story about ourselves as well. And we can also give a thought to the fact that harming non-human animals also harms us, and explore and really think about how these links are really tightly woven together. And that relying on animal experimentation really keeps us and makes us more unsafe. So onto our next section, or third section, the barriers to transitioning to animal-free innovation. So this is a very messy mind map. It's an earlier sketch from a book chapter I'm writing at the moment. So we're not going to dwell on this, but I'm only showing this to really exemplify how I'm considering this as a very complex issue. It's hard to kind of really pull one aspect and really say this is the core issue, this is the core thing. They're all deeply interrelated. That's the only thing I want to show with this very messy mind map. We're not going to explore it any further, but I've tried to pick out the most salient parts from this, and especially how it relates to early career researchers, or how you can tangentially relate to it. And that's what we're going to be looking at now in just a little bit. So one very key barrier to transitioning is looking at social and institutional barriers. So this is really a lens that I carry with me a lot when I'm looking at my work or looking at safety assessment. I think I often hear that this is a big issue is the technical developments. We need to have more alternatives to animal testing. And then the sort of science will kind of bring it about, and we'll have a transformation and we'll transition away. But the way I'm seeing it is that it's really a social and institutional barriers which are keeping this or upholding this system. So legal systems reinforce anthropocentrism. For example, in safety assessment, it's also mandatory to have animal testing if you globally. So if you need to produce a new chemical or a new drug, in many regulatory systems, it's almost unavoidable to use animal testing. So of course, this reinforces social barriers as well. But mindset and values are also very important in this. So as Catherine mentioned in the beginning here, there is a gold standard, so-called gold standard in both safety assessment and biomedical research to say that the use of animals is just basic. That's how it's done. And there's a bias, and this also comes with it, a bias against NAMS. So NAMS here is a new approach to methodology. So it's also using it synonymously as saying the alternatives to animal testing. So not only does this particular system say like we need to use animal testing, but it's also saying that the alternatives are bad and there's a bias against them. So here we're really talking about a social and institutional barriers again. And we're also seeing this, that regulation and academic disciplines can be very conservative. So what I mean by this is that there is a kind of momentum to the system as it is going now. There's a business as usual idea to it. So, but it's also, I do have a lot of empathy if you are a regulator and you are charged with, say you're in the EU and you're charged with keeping the safety of millions of people. You don't want to be that person who okays something that then gets millions of people sick or exposes something dangerous. So there's a certain logic to it as well, for them to be a bit conservative in what they're doing. There's also some legal scholars which have pointed out that, and this is, I know mostly about the EU, but a little about the US as well, but that the legal system can accommodate more noms. So there is legal basis, both in terms of having alternatives which are validated or qualified in the regulatory system, but they're not being used. So to me, these are really another inflection point to say that these points to it's that behavior and practices and social institutional barriers are keeping us from really using the most amount of alternatives, and that this is a really a very insidious and important barrier to consider when we're looking at this transition. Of course, behind all of this, and this is why I mentioned this at the beginning, anthropocentrism is a great barrier. The current system that we're talking about, science and capitalism, cannot work without it. Dismantling animal testing would be really changing how power operates a bit, and I think it will, and we'll explore that later. But really, dismantling anthropocentrism is a big barrier. Not to say that we shouldn't, but it's also worth considering. Another barrier to transitioning is even how science production is organized. I'm just taking out a few examples here, but we can talk about, there's many different inflection points we can have in this. One example is that currently there's very few individuals which wield a disproportionate influence in a particular discipline. So few individuals has a disproportionate share of articles produced, and these are in turn disproportionately cited. So this means that few individuals wield a disproportionate amount of power in these systems. So it's also reinforces a particular way for science and academia to keep itself in this bubble. And we're going to be exploring this bubble in just a bit. Another is the kind of big science production aspect. So this sort of means pointing to the fact that it's a bit hard nowadays to do cutting edge science in your backyard or in your living room. To do science, you need to have a lot of institutional backing, financing, which can tend to be coming from states or from industry. And again, this is where we're seeing how this is tied into a bigger, broader socio-political system. And also the rapid production of science. So the idea of basically publish or perish. So if you're rushing out to try and keep your career going, or to get the next grant, you have to make sure that you're publishing. And this doesn't necessarily is not necessarily conducive to really re-questioning the whole system that's trying to fund you. So these are just some of the aspects that I think are relevant when we're talking about this, but we could talk about many others as well. So I mentioned the bubble earlier, and I think one of the main barriers that we have to transitioning to animal-free innovation is what's called epistemic communities. So I have a little diagram here, and we're going to walk through it together. So definition of an epistemic community is really you can really think of it as a social network, and it's kind of reinforced and by a number of different parts, but we can break it down here a bit to begin with. So in one part, we have academia, so universities and all that comes with it, and all the things which I just mentioned in terms of the big science production and few individuals which are really key parts in this. But to get funding or to get this big science part, you need funding, for example, from the states or from research institutions or etc. And you can also get this from industry. This is particularly salient in safety assessments, where regulatory agencies are working together with experts in academia, but also in industry. So in this sense, we can really see this as a coalition between three different parts, which are helping each other define a number of different ways that you can do science. So this is defining that this sort of data is acceptable. This sort of methodology is acceptable. We see a high consensus between everyone involved in this group. And you see this so that you can have rapid discovery of science. Doesn't help if you question definitions every other day or question methodology every other day. You need to move on together and to be able to create the science together. So it makes sense in this sense that you have this. So in this sense, we see a high internal coalition between everyone involved here. So in this sense, we can sort of see that the gold standard is really embedded in the system. This is where it's really kept and gate kept and reinforced constantly. So let's take an example. If you're an individual researcher saying, hey, I really want to work on these really cool brain organoids, the NAMs, or alternatives to animal testing, you as an early career researcher might be talking to your supervisor or your principal investigator. But if they are part of this epistemic community, they could say, well, I don't see how will get funding, because to me, the gold standard should be that we're using animals and animal data. This is the data that we know. This is the data that I know as a supervisor. And this is also how we will get funding, either from the industry or from state funding agencies. So again, we can see the elements that we touched on earlier, whether it be regulatory agencies here, or the incentives to produce products. So if you want to put a chemical on the market, you are talking with people in regulation, you're following state regulatory systems, which in turn take their cues from the academia and the experts there. And again, the loop, it keeps going on and keeps going around. So you, as your early career researcher, are saying, well, I want to work on these systems. Your supervisor might say, well, I don't know how we'll get funded. I don't know how you'll get published, because in this bubble, this doesn't work as well. Which is why we need another bubble, another epistemic community, which instead does reinforce these things. So here we have a few examples of silico methods, organoid chip, or organoids. So the way I'm conceptualizing a lot of my work is really seeing how we have it's a battle for between two different communities, and they're placed in different places in the regulatory system, in the political system, in the economic system. But right now we're seeing really a change in the discussion. So now it's a lot more blurry between a lot of people saying that we still do need animal testing and some saying we don't, but we can sort of chart them along these two different communities. And this, I would say it's really useful to think of them as using this kind of lens as epistemic communities. I mentioned, so you can see this is a very circular kind of thinking right here, and we're going to be exploring some of these in the next few slides as well. So here we see the golden standards outside of this epistemic community. We might say, okay, well, I mean, isn't science objective? Isn't it rational? Well, in science technology studies, the idea is rather that science is constructed. Hence, that's why it's used. I'm citing and talking about epistemic communities and the fact that a mindset, a value change, is just as important as anything else. And that's through this theoretical lens that science is socially constructed, which also means that it's subject to social examination and also to social change. So, prefacing a bit what we're going to talk about in the last part of this talk. So I was talking about loops. Another great barrier to transitioning is public awareness. So coming at this from more political science aspects and the transition theories that we were working with in our consortium as well, this really feels like a very closed transition. So what I mean by this is that there's quite little awareness of animal testing and its alternatives by the general publics in general. But there's also very little research on the subject from a social science perspective. And it's also why these are also very open questions, also how to engage on this question. But this also means that there's little awareness of animal testing and its alternatives. There's little pressure to change or accelerate the transition. Now, I say little pressure, it's comparative, right? I mean, if you compare to the social movements for global justice or for climate change, these are really, really big movements, which are really big voice in the current social political system. We can obviously see that animal testing doesn't have the same amount of space in this, and this is really what I'm talking about. We shouldn't dismiss, for example, the European citizen initiatives in Europe or other public pressure campaigns, which have really done a lot of tangible work. This is a really broad picture. But again, this is a kind of loop. So this is a constant feedback loop. If you have little awareness, there's little pressure on the political system. So there's less pressure to accelerate, and then loop goes around again. So this is really reinforcing this epistemic community parts that we have here. We can see the different aspects being reinforced here. Another loop is in the trust or confidence you have in NAMs or alternative to animal testing. So if, as we had here in this epistemic community, we have a few experts on the alternative to animal testing, and we have a production system that's based on animal testing, that will also create science based on animal testing, and then the loop goes on again. Regulatory systems now are legally bound to uphold the gold standard. This is more or less true. This is thankfully changing in different ways, but as I mentioned, you don't want to be that toxicologist in a regulatory system who gets millions of people sick for whatever reason. So there is some reluctance to changing there. But industry also just wants their regulation. They want to produce products. They want to put it on the market. So they might not necessarily be the first ones to say that they want to rock the boat. But there's a big feedback loop going on here. And this is, again, reinforced in this epistemic community that we see. Another barrier to transitioning is education. So another feedback loop. If you have poor education on NAMs, so I'm talking from primary school all the way to higher education, you're going to have less experts in academia. You're going to have less alternatives being developed and more mistrust in alternatives as well. So again, this is where it's really interesting and important to highlight the sort of topic of the day, which is early career researchers. This makes this system all the more important. If we have more awareness of this, then we can develop more experts in academia and more NAMs and have more trust in NAMs. But right now we have sort of feedback loop going here. So as I was alluding to earlier in my very messy mind map in the beginning, I see them as all being interrelated. So as we just looked on earlier, if we have mistrust in NAMs, this is going to be also affecting other feedback loops. So for example, that's science based on animal testing. And in this sense, I think they're all kind of wheels in a big machine, or kind of feedback loops feeding back into feedback loops, which makes changing this quite complex. But it doesn't mean that it's not being done or that it can't be done. We're going to be looking at that later. So just to round this off, slowly but surely, one barrier we can have, some other barriers we have, we call them dishonorable mentions, is what I call 3 R's washing animal testing. So I think we can familiar with greenwashing, where you put up a front of saying that you're going to be sustainable or climate neutral or whatever, but this is actually a front for saying this is business as usual. I think the 3 R's methodology that we have, which is the kind of treatment of care for animals used in animal testing, which called for refining, meaning to reduce the amount of distress or pain that's being inflicted upon the animal. Reduction, which is to reduce the number of animals used in animal testing, and replacement is to eventually transition or to replace the animal testing thing in general. But I think what we're seeing a lot is instead of the use of 2 R's instead of 3. So to use of refinement, reduction, but replacement is difficult. And here we're seeing analogs of this, and also in climate governance or in biodiversity governance as well, in that really doing that last step of phasing out animal testing is really the difficult part. Really, the last step to really phasing out unsustainable practices in climate governance is really the difficult part. And that's why we're using transformative governance as part of our theoretical model, which really stresses the use of that we need to look at underlying causes for all these things. So a lot of the things I've been talking about earlier is really these underlying causes, the anthropocentrism, the tying, how this is all tied to power relations, etc. But also to look at multiple transitions at the same time. We can't silo everything. We can't just think at, okay, we'll just focus on Europe without looking at the US or vice versa, or we can't just look at just at Korea or just Japan. We need to look at this globally and really see how the interconnections between this as a global system, but also to take into account the general publics. And I'm saying general publics on purpose because there's not a monolith of just the general public. And they're really, I think, undervalued in terms of their role to play in all this. So I mentioned the European Citizens Initiative earlier. is one example. This putting pressure on the political system in Europe. And we're also going to be talking about this way at the end here as part of the solutions. So really, and to focus on this phasing out. So this is a really crucial part of what we're talking about, is this replacement aspect, which really needs to be stressed and needs to be underlined much more, whether it be in climate governance or in animal testing. So we have different parts here in transformative governance, and the way we see this is that they all need to be put in together. And really, all of this spells out a need for transformative change to really replace and phase out animal testing. So that's really the highlight I want to stress here. So takeaway messages to sum up a little bit from this part is that we have multiple social and institutional barriers which are at play, and they're all linked in a complex way, and that epistemic communities are a useful way to organize these barriers and to really think about how we really that the organization of science in general is really and how this is embedded in the social and institutional systems is really keeping us from accelerating away from this current system. So now to look at the opportunities for change and how do we get away from this? So the first, what we see here is a diagram that's taken from the transition science. And it's really trying to explain how you have two different systems which are changing. So we have the golden standard here, which is the current system that we have. And what this diagram is trying to explain is how you can have a breakdown of one system and the emergence of another. And it starts often by having some kind of experimentation. So here we can use alternatives to animal testing, organoids, for example, but you can use the transition sciences this for looking at many different aspects. So we haven't always used cars, we used horses before. We haven't always used petroleum, etc. So this is really really agnostic to any kind of technology we're talking about. But really, this is the emergence of one technology and the phasing out of another. As you can see, this theory here has a number of different steps to it. And I think really where we are now is this part here. So as I mentioned, we have two different, the way I see it is that we have two different epistemic communities talking. So we have the one which says that this is the golden standard, the other one saying that we need to use alternatives. And at the moment, we're in the kind of chaos phase. Now, this shouldn't be too scary. I'll invoke this quote to say that chaos is more an opportunity. It's a call for invention. It's a call to action. It's a call for us to really see this as a way of really putting ourselves in and accelerating the use of one technology over another. So currently, we have one well, on the one side, we have the regulatory system, which says you need to use animal testing, but we have a lot of technology and a lot of use of NOMs, which are really cutting edge and providing, in many cases, better results than animal testing itself. So what I'm seeing from this is that we're going to have more and more of a breakdown of the use of animal testing as a gold standard, and the emergence and we're seeing now the institutionalization of use of alternatives instead. So that instead we have a new regime which is based on the alternatives and the phasing out of the use of animal testing. So an opportunity for change is really looking at, I want to encourage us to really look at the social aspects. So if science is socially constructed, that also means it can be socially deconstructed. So we absolutely need the tools and technology, or we need to develop more NOMs, but we also need to deconstruct the gold standard. And this means a changing of mindset. It means a changing of thinking about what kind of data do we need, what kind of methodologies do we need. And also to say, like, we could and should transfer and transition away from this. And this is really part of the task of deconstructing the gold standard. It's really a socially reinforced perception that we need to talk about. And this really means about changing our mindset of values, and this will change our behavior. But the key thing is to do this in the right parts. So it means talking with the regulators, academics, and also in industry. But in terms of opportunities for change, it's already here. It's already happening. There are many different initiatives that we can see, whether we're talking about conferences or associations all across the world. Here we're seeing the Asian Federation for Societies to Alternative Animal Experiments, or in India, CAAT here in Baltimore, where I'm at now, or in the Netherlands. There are many things which are happening at the moment. In terms of journals, we can see this as well. Two prominent examples here. And in this sense, I think this is really bolstering the epistemic communities that I was talking about earlier. We're seeing this just get bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is what's really giving me hope in terms of this whole sector, and that this epistemic community is growing. And if this is something you want to be a part of, you can absolutely be a part of it. And of course, I'm encouraging everyone to think about it and to do so. So another opportunity for change is to find others. The science and technology studies literature I've been looking at says that emerging disciplines are kind of emerge like a social movement, and key part of this is organizing, right? So to find others in this epistemic community, which means publishing in other journals or going to conferences, some of them which I just mentioned. Another example from the country where I'm living at studying at the moment in Netherlands is Young TPI, a group of early career researchers which have come together and were involved in use of alternatives in animal testing. And I can really say just how fruitful and useful it's been for myself, just to feel like I have a community to really talk about this, and also to learn immensely from this. So I really think it's a model that we can learn from and inspire in other places to do this as well. So we can change one man at a time and one movement at a time as well. Another opportunity to transition is public awareness. So I mentioned earlier that you have a little awareness of animal testing in NUMS, you have a little pressure to change it, and there's little pressure to accelerate. But it's two sides of the same coin. If you have more awareness, you have more pressure to accelerate. So it's in that sense, we can, instead of thinking of it as a closed transition, we can try and open it. And we can do this by doing public engagement, by putting pressure on political elites to do this, to really accelerate this transition. And in this sense, I just want to give a shout out to the Being Students Association, which were protesting today, and which I was part of a few years ago as well, when we were doing this at Radboud University. And this is a typical example of the sort of public engagement we need. And according to the theory we're working with in transformative governance, this is really a crucial part of what we need to do as well. We shouldn't underestimate the power that public engagement can have to helping us in this transition. And instead of seeing this as a kind of the general public as being a threat to this or not understanding this, I think we really should consider how you can instead be allies and to really help us to accelerate this transition. So just to round off this talk, just go back to some of the main takeaways here, and that first is to say that science is political. And I think this is a really important part to think about, that we are not neutral in this, and we shouldn't be. Not thinking of this as neutral helps us to really orient ourselves in the system and to really see the ways in which we can better act and better really direct our attention to how we can accelerate this transition, both for animal health, human health, and planetary health in general, environmental health. Also, I really think we should entertain and think about how the fate of non-human animals and humans are tied. We're often encouraged and conditioned to think of them as being far, as a them. But really, their fate is really closely tied to ours. Their suffering is really close to us all the time. We're intimately involved in a system which perpetuates their suffering, but also perpetuates suffering for us and keeps us more unsafe in general. In this sense, this highlights again how these barriers are very self-reinforcing, complex, and systemic. But this really shouldn't deter us from thinking of opportunities for changing this. This can be done through practices by looking at our social behavior and our values and worldviews. But another great opportunity to change is to look at organization and to find other researchers, find other organizations which are involved in this sector, involved in this movement, because I really do think it is a movement and it will become a bigger movement as it goes. And that we really should think of public engagement as a really great tool, as an ally, and the publics in general as an ally to do this. They've really proven this in the past and still doing so now, so we really shouldn't abandon that ever. With that, I'd really like to thank you all very much for your attention. Again, big thanks to Catherine for inviting me here today. Thanks for CAAT for hosting me. And yeah, thank you all very much.